Welcome everybody. I'm Susan Murray, Director of the David Hume Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you here to Royal Bank's offices in George Street. So we're talking about the tracker this morning, the Understanding Scotland Economy Tracker. We've now been doing it over 2 years. It's brought to you by the David Hume Institute and the Diffley Partnership. The David Hume Institute, for those, I know we've got some new people here today that haven't been to our events before. So we're an independent think tank which has been working since 1985 to bring you rigorous research and thought-provoking events. The tracker is accompanied by our Economy in Plain English series, which is part of our mission to get more people thinking and talking about the economy. Now, we've got lots to get through this morning, and I'm not going to spend a long time introducing our speakers, but I'm just going to, you've had the bios in advance, so I'm just going to introduce them very quickly. So Mark Diffley, he's the seasoned presenter you'll recognise from television and radio, the leader of the Diffley Partnership, and we work with him every quarter on the Understanding Scotland Economy Tracker. He'll talk for about 15 minutes, going through all the slides and the data and the graphs you'd expect us to have in the presentation. And then we'll have reflections from Murray Spowage, who's director of the Fraser of Allender Institute, and then Kevin Havelock, the regional director for corporate, commercial and business banking at Royal Bank. Now, these results are just a few weeks old. We turn them around in super fast time so that you, in your roles, can use the data when it's fresh and still relevant. We particularly wanted to do it this month because it's only a week until the UK budget. So having this data when it's only 2 weeks old is critically important. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you for the warm welcome. Thank you for your support throughout this. This is the 10th wave of the tracker. We're really pleased again to be working with the David Hume Institute, and as Susan says, thanks to colleagues at RBS for hosting us this morning. It's nice to see everyone, some familiar faces and some new faces as well. I'm sure some, if not all of you, will have seen some of this data already. It's been published this morning. It's got some media traction this morning and some coverage. Always interesting to see what the media alight on as the kind of key stories. Not necessarily always what I would say are the kind of key findings, but whatever. And there's some really interesting stuff in here. As always, there is huge amounts of data. So what I'll do is really just kind of basically scratch the surface. The report is available. It's on our website. It's on Susan's website, and it goes into much more detail. And there will be opportunities to ask questions about the data later on. But there's loads to get through. The survey itself, as Susan mentioned, just a couple of things about it. This is the 10th wave. So since September. Quarterly since September 2021, which I think is a really important point to make because this now is quite a significant evidence base to measure what we as a country are thinking about economic issues, how optimistic we are, hint not particularly at the moment, what our kind of spending patterns are, what we're intending to do over the coming period. And for people in this room, who work in financial services, who work in other parts of the economy. Data and evidence like this, I think, is really, really important in building up a big picture of how the country is feeling at any particular point in time. It's a big survey, so we interview over 2,000 people each quarter, concertinaed into a week on purpose because we want to get a kind of snapshot in time. And we don't want external events over a period of time to bias the data or we want to kind of minimise that from happening. And the size of the survey enables us to speak with confidence, not just about the population, the nation as a whole, but to be able to sort of dig meaningfully into the data and give you some more sort of granular insights. And I'll pick up on some of those as we go through the next sort of 10 or 15 minutes or so. So this is kind of really important data and really important evidence. And I suppose as I was writing the kind of press release, or at least the quote for the press release over the last couple of days, and trying to think, well, what's the big what's the big message from this? I think it is that, at least as far as the public is concerned, the cost of living crisis, as I know we've had lots of discussions about whether we call it a cost of living crisis, but whatever, I think it is the sort of generic term that we use. The period of kind of economic uncertainty that we're going through is still very much a thing as far as the majority of people out there are concerned. I know we live in a world of different indicators. We look at, how things are moving, whether it's kind of inflation, whether it's productivity, and things move up and down. But actually, as far as people in the externally in the big wide world are concerned, actually we are still going through a period of significant uncertainty, and that is borne out, as you will see, by a lot of the figures. I particularly point to what I'll cover in a minute around people's ongoing pessimism as far as both the economy and their own financial situations are concerned. Data we've got around ongoing cautiousness about people's spending habits, and continued, I think, widespread sort of what we would consider to be kind of coping mechanisms in terms of how people are reacting to what is happening out there in the economy. As usual, I start with a couple of contextual questions. These are not kind of meant to be overtly political, and indeed we don't ask any political questions. We don't ask about people's voting, so we don't kind of analyse these by people's voting intentions. We're aware that this can be interpreted politically, but really this is a contextual question. We ask it at the beginning of the survey, is the country going in the right or wrong direction? And what you can see there is something quite significant, or a couple of quite significant things. Firstly, that we've now got nearly 6 in 10 of us thinking that Scotland is actually going in the wrong direction, and only around a quarter of us thinking the country is going in the right direction. And the key thing here is the trend. So there are two things here. One is the trend. When we started the survey, the series back in September 2021, we were pretty much split down the middle on this question. But over this period of time, over the preceding 2.5 years, we've seen some quite significant differences emerging. As always, and as a theme that will run through my remarks this morning, whether it's this question or the other questions, people are not feeling this evenly. So we know age is a big factor here. So the older you are, the more likely you are to say that the country is going in the wrong direction. It's 51% wrong direction amongst the youngest cohort, but up to 2/3, 66% amongst the oldest cohort. We know that men feel more likely to say that things are moving in the wrong direction, about 2/3 of men, and less so for women. So there are, as you would expect, not everyone feels the same way, and I would encourage people to go and look at the data more closely. So the other contextual question we ask at the beginning of the survey is around people's priorities. What do you think are the 3 most important issues facing Scotland today? Slight apologies, not real apologies, but slight apologies for the messiness of the slide, particularly at the bottom. There are a kind of cluster of issues that somewhere between 10 and 20% of us. But the 2 standout issues here, as they have been consistently almost throughout this series, are the NHS, particularly poignant for lots of people during winter times for reasons that I won't need to explain. So you can see the peaks here around that are particularly the case when we carry out the survey in winter months. And the other one is the cost of living and inflation. And as I always say at these events, look in September 2021, how many people were worried about inflation? About 20%. And look at the peak up to over 50%. And of course that just reflects what we've all kind of been through, and for a lot of people are still going through. again here, and I think this is really, okay, forgive me for just pointing out what might be the obvious, but I think it is worth still saying, there is very much an age differential here, and we'll come back to this several times through the morning. Young people overwhelmingly will talk about the cost of living and inflation. When I say young people, up through to people in their kind of 40s, if we can still call that young. I think we probably can, just about. Are more prioritised cost of living and inflation, much more. Older people, for reasons which, again, are probably quite obvious, are more likely to highlight issues around healthcare and the NHS. A couple of other things that are worth pointing out, and again, not in the spirit of anything political, but given it is worth, we only usually add anything that comes in at 10% or more on here, but it's worth pointing out that over the period of this of the survey, the last 2.5 years, concern or mention of the constitutional devolution issues has really fallen quite significantly, and down now to fewer than one in 10 of us mentioning that as one of our primary concerns, and it is just worth kind of, I think, pointing that out in passing, if nothing more. So on to the sort of what I would call the kind of beef of the survey. We also ask people about their economic priorities. This is primarily a survey about the economy and about people's economic habits, spending habits, behaviours, and so forth. So we ask about economic priorities as well. So three most important issues facing the Scottish economy. And you can see the answers here. And the numbers at the side are just the measurements or the differentials from the last survey back in November 2023. And what you can see is not a huge amount has changed in the last quarter. Again, the cost of living and inflation is the number one economic issue, and then a cluster of issues around living standards and wages, spending on public services, and so on and so forth. But again, at the risk of sounding like a bit of a broken record here, there are a couple of things to point out. One, I think, is that concern about public services has actually really grown, although it's only gone up by 3 percentage points in the last quarter. It's actually gone up by more than 10 percentage points in the last 18 months, which I think reflects to me a growing conversation and a growing concern, I think, around the state or the condition of many of our public services. We talked about the NHS a while ago, but I think there is probably evidence now that there is more concern about the condition of public services than there has been in the past, and we'll see obviously in an election year how much that I'm sure it will feature as a key issue. So that's the first thing to bear in mind. But again, there are real age differentials here. The population does not prioritise the same things, and the key differential in the population here is age. So young people will prioritise the cost of living and the second issue here, which is the living standards and wages. So 72% of those aged 16 to 34 say that the cost of living is one of their key economic issues. That falls to under 50% of those in the oldest cohort, 65 plus. And similarly, we find that 44% of those in the youngest cohort mention living standards and wages, compared to just 22% of those in the oldest cohort. Now that completely makes sense, right? That absolutely makes sense. But it does, I think, really kind of highlight the need to sort of look beyond the kind of headlines and some of this data. And similarly, on the opposite side of the ledger, so to speak, public services are more of a concern for those in older cohorts. So 38% of those 65 plus say that public spending on public services is a priority, compared to just 22% of those aged 16 to 34 in the youngest cohort. So again, I think reflecting the relationship between age and economic priorities. So One of the things we're really, really keen to measure in this survey is optimism and pessimism. So the extent to which people feel both about their own personal financial situation and about the economy as a whole, the extent to which they feel things are getting better or worse. And we do this in two ways. We ask people to look backwards, so to compare the current situation to how they feel, the past situation, to compare now to the previous 12 months, and we ask them also to look forward to compare now to how they think they will fare in the next, or the economy will fare in the next 12 months. And I won't go through all of these figures on here because I'll show the trend in a minute, which I think is probably more interesting and more and more sort of insightful. But what this does is highlight, I think, a couple of things which we see not just in this survey, but we see generally about surveys, in which I think I probably mention every time or most times that I'm here, is that we tend to be more pessimistic about the economy as a whole than we are about our own personal finances. So we're slightly more optimistic about our own situations than we are about what's going on around us in the economy. And we're slightly more optimistic about the future than we are about the past. So both of those, I think, are actually quite good things in amongst not many kind of positive things to report. And that we find that every quarter. We find that in other kind of survey evidence. So it's kind of worth bearing that in mind. The overwhelming. You don't need me to point this out because you can see the numbers here. We are still feeling pretty pessimistic about life, but here's the trend over the last. Here's the trend over the last 2.5 years. So what we've done on here is present the kind of net scores. So we take optimism scores and we subtract pessimism scores, and we present them as a net score here. So when you see this -23, that is optimism minus pessimism, which, as you've just seen in the previous slide, they are all in the negative, right? They are all in the negative. What this slide does is reinforce my point throughout that we tend to be more optimistic about our own personal finances and about the future than we are about the past. And it's really quite insightful if we look at the starting point. Even if we go back to September 2021, we weren't all singing and dancing and thinking that everything was great. We were still, on most of these measures, in fact on all of these measures, in negative territory. But during the majority of this period, particularly around the second half of 2022 and the first half of 2023, those levels of pessimism really did hit the floor. I mean, they were November 2022. You can see there. There was we were almost entirely pessimistic. You can't get more than -100%, right? And we were almost at that in terms of how people were thinking, how people were feeling about the general economic conditions in the country compared to the previous year. So, as the only way is up, or whatever, the only way was up slightly, and what we are seeing is some recovery. This recovery is not even. This is not being felt evenly across the population. We see, and we talk about this every time, we talk about how households with children are still significantly more pessimistic. Those who live in the most deprived neighbourhoods of the country, as measured by SIMD, the Index of Multiple Deprivation, we can still see really significant differentials in pessimism, in increased pessimism there. I think if I were to make some case for recovery here, you can see it. Things aren't as bad as they were this time last year. Although in the last quarter there hasn't really been any what I would call statistically significant changes. So, as always, and as I always say, we'll be looking at whether this kind of trend continues or whether we have sort of reached a sort of new normal, in a sense, in terms of where people's levels of optimism and pessimism are. And then just a couple more, I think, from me before I hand on to Mary. This is a measure that we have been looking at now for nearly the last couple of years, the last 18 months or so, and this is around responses to the cost of living crisis. We continue to see, significant numbers of people taking fairly drastic action around what they are doing in their behaviours to deal with what are still continuing, if not rising costs and rising prices, even if the edge has been taken off inflation a wee bit. I would say these are kind of maybe lagging indicators. I mean, prices may have not come down, but inflation may not be as high as it was, but certainly the evidence suggests that this is not particularly feeding through into people's behaviours just yet. We always look at the anxiety question here, and that's always the one for me. It's pretty much when this data arrives on my desk, that's probably the first thing that I always look at, and we can still see that 30% of people are feeling anxious about the cost of living crisis, maybe losing sleep, and so forth. And so this is one of the kind of more qualitative measures of how people are reacting. And this, I think, just adds to the evidence base that we are, as far as the public is concerned, far from sort of in the clear as far as this is concerned. And then the last couple of slides, the last slide, in fact, is around buying intentions. So we ask people, whether they're going to spend more or less on a series of goods, services over the next 12 months. Just to point out, what this shows is the proportion of people who say they are going to be spending less, right? So you can see, and it's not, it tracks spending less peaking in the same way that optimism, that pessimism was peaking as well. So it kind of makes sense and adds up as far as the sort of trajectory of the rest of the data is concerned. But it's really intuitive. If you look at restaurants, for instance, spending in restaurants, back in September 2021, that was about 25% of people saying that they would spend less on eating out in the next 12 months. It's now 44%, as you can see here. And you can see similar patterns. Spending on clothing, that was about 11% say they would be spending less in 2021, and it's now 41%. Now, the data has improved somewhat, so we are off the peaks, and we are now. But again, when we don't ask this every quarter. When we last asked this, was 9 months ago in May 2023. Not much has changed actually since then, and I think it's probably one of those indicators that we should probably measure again before the next 9 months passes. I think there's probably some more to say about some of these measures. But you can say, so this again just, I think, builds the evidence base that I'm afraid this is still these are still issues that are being felt quite widely, and always, of course, bear in mind that not everyone is experiencing this in the same way as I've tried to point out, which is in the data. On that sort of cheery note, I think I'll go home. No, I won't. I'll sit down. Thanks very much.
Yeah, when I was reading the results, it can be difficult to see reasons to be optimistic. But I think for the first thing, leaving aside the Scotland going in the right or the wrong direction figures that you first showed us, other indicators, both of business and consumer sentiment, are sort of showing what you're seeing in terms of how people are feeling. Not positive, not as positive even as the autumn of 2021, prior to Omicron and all that. Remember that? And prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the energy price spike and so on. But it is getting more positive over the last few months and quarters. And that's definitely what we're seeing in wider data that we collect from businesses, for example. Not brilliant, not really, really optimistic, but slowly getting more optimistic, perhaps, about the year to come. Still in negative territory, though. Absolutely, we'd agree with that. I suppose from the macro perspective, businesses in particular are looking ahead to potential interest rate cuts over the course of the year, perhaps in the second half of the year, as a glimmer on the horizon. And it probably is on the horizon, given various things that are going on now, and the likely inflationary spike in April when minimum wage is increased, albeit offset with the energy prices coming down. So I think that glimmer is improving business sentiment significantly, and to some extent feeding through to how consumers are feeling. So there is some positives in the data. We all know that inflation has come down, but significant price rises have been baked into lots of different areas of the economy, and particularly concerning for those on lower incomes, there is things like energy prices, which are coming down, but food prices, which are not coming down. The inflation rate is still fairly high. It's come down from these very high levels that we saw, last Easter time. So that's a huge concern for those on lower incomes, that these price rises are sort of stabilising, yes, but they are baked in now, which means they're spending a much larger proportion of their income on essentials than they were 2 or 3 years ago. And that's what you're seeing. Yes, concern is easing a bit, but people are still operating in a more precarious fashion than they were a couple of years ago. And that's particularly concerning. And as public services seem to be creaking, and I think it's particularly, over the debate about council tax and council tax freezes, I think local services in particular, people are feeling are being affected by, there's just no fat left to cut. There's nothing more to get efficiencies out of local services. So things are just disappearing. And those who are more likely to call on those services, are really feeling it. So I think the services delivered by local government are particularly in people's minds. And it has been interesting, the debate around the council tax freeze, I think citizens are more likely than in any discussion about a tax cut I've seen before to say that they don't want the tax cut because they don't think it's the right thing to do for local services. So I think that's really interesting. We are just closing our business survey today, actually. So it'll be really interesting to see how businesses and business sentiments chiming with how people are feeling, because the fieldwork periods over a little bit longer, but it'll be really interesting to see to what extent these two things sort of line up. The chart about Scotland going on the right or wrong direction, I think it is pretty hard to divorce that from political events. Obviously the optimism or otherwise about the economy tracks pretty well what's happened to inflation, which has been driven by some political events. We all know what happened in the autumn of 2022, which would obviously affect people's feelings about the economy. But I think it's interesting in the face of rising optimism, albeit still negative territory on the economy, we're seeing this feeling that Scotland isn't going in the right direction sort of continuing to rise. And it might be that sort of sets the scene for the coming general election and how people are generally feeling about the situation and politicians and politics in general. I think that's a really interesting finding. And I'll certainly be digging into the differentials in age and gender and all these things, which are very interesting. The age sort of differential is really interesting. And we're very interested in the sort of opportunities for younger people in particular, given that a lot of wealth is concentrated in older age groups, particularly on the housing side. And housing, I think, is key here. And what that means about optimism about the future for young people, I think that's a real concern. And there's a real intergenerational fairness issue, which I think we need to address if young people are going to feel more optimistic about the future. So I'd say let's do look for the, you know, the positives in the figures. But I think the difference between the first chart and how people are feeling about the economy is really telling. That they feel things are getting better in the economy, but they are, you know, feeling a bit of plague on all your houses on what's going on in politics and the general political situation at the moment.
Thanks, Mary. Over to Kevin.
Thank you for that, Mark. Thank you for the presentation. I was just trying to set a timer on my watch so I don't run over 5 minutes. There we go. And thanks also for the opportunity to host you all today. I'm delighted that you've been able to join us. So my plan really is just to give some reflections directly from the point of business. And in the Royal Bank, we look after more than a third of businesses in Scotland. So we get a really good sense. We talk to them every day. And I suppose, Mark, in your presentation, I got the sense of the role that business plays in creating some of that prosperity, you know, the people, the families and businesses that we're looking to thrive, and how that can help to fund public services. And actually, business is in a very similar place to the households and the people that you talked about, pulling lots of levers, have done an amazing job to pull levers to get to this point. We are beginning to see a couple of big issues bubbling up. Staff is a huge issue. Getting labour, keeping labour, and making sure it's properly trained is a big issue for all of our customers. Some sectors are hit worse than others. Construction, healthcare, leisure, hospitality, IT and comms are hit quite badly in there, so they're finding it quite tough. Some other things are becoming less of a concern, but what we are beginning to see is that cash balances are beginning to reduce. So lots of particularly money that was drawn in COVID is being repaid really quite quickly, and some of that stuff's coming to an end now. But we're seeing quite a lot of working capital increase requests. So overdrafts, invoice discounting, more assets being funded. So we're beginning generally to see businesses take on a little more debt. But actually that's aligned with them actually feeling like there are opportunities to grow coming around the corner. So we've narrowly avoided recession. Our own PMI survey last year showed, the Purchase Managers Index showed contraction for 6 months in a row. January's tipped into positive territory. The labour market is beginning to ease, and there has been some softening in the number of vacancies and some softening in the starting salaries as well. So there is generally more optimism, and we're not seeing a huge amount of stress coming through the book. As I said, customers have done an amazing job in terms of pulling levers, managing their costs and finding new markets. Interestingly though, I don't want to enter the debate about whether Scotland is headed in the right or wrong direction, but our PMI survey tells us that concerns about the impact of government policy are increasing, and that's started to see that come through quite strongly in the results. We talked about employment already here, availability of workers. I think just on the point of interest rates, the market hasn't quite made up its mind where interest rates will go this year. We are thinking somewhere between either 2 quarter-point cuts or 4 quarter-point cuts, depending upon where inflation gets to. And we have a general election in there as well. But there are customers who are beginning to feel more optimistic. Transactions are beginning to progress again. I had a roundup with my team yesterday about the lending transactions that we are working on with customers, and they have certainly come back in the new year. Quarter 3 and 4 last year were quite quiet, but there are now deals coming out, and I am seeing work in progress for facilities that we're providing at a higher level than I have done for quite a while. Some of that being overdraft working capital, which is effectively rebuilding liquidity in some of the businesses that are there. However, as I would say to anyone, this is a time where our customers need to be thinking really carefully about the decisions that they make. but they are generally now looking for new markets where they can go next. Big challenge as always is productivity, and that's part of the conundrum here. And you talked about customers changing their spending habits. A proportion of our customers have described that they have delayed investment decisions within the last 12 months. They've either scrapped or delayed. Now, actually, they could effectively be the same things in some people's eyes, but there is a lack of business investment that we are seeing into our customer book. However, we've avoided recession. Businesses are feeling more optimistic, albeit have a sense that it will be a slow return out of this. And we might not see anything more significant than pretty much between 0.5% and 1% growth in Scotland in 2024. And actually, it's probably only going to be about 1.5% when we get into 2025. So I think the themes there, Mark, chime quite closely with what we're seeing played back in the survey from business. Susan.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, we promised you breakfast and we promised you brain food, and I think we've definitely got that in those reflections and the presentation. Now, I'm going to not ask any questions, so that I leave the floor open to you. Please do come forward quickly with your questions, because we've only got about 20 minutes for them, so don't dilly-dally, because otherwise we won't get to you. If you can say your name and also your organisation, if that's applicable, that would be wonderful. So who wants to start us off with a question?
Thank you. Bruce Beveridge, TÜV Süd, a global engineering business. Really, just picking up on one of the last points, the increase in request and support for working capital, is there a sector-specific element to that? Is it clustered, or is it just across the piece?
So it's generally across the piece. It's not really in manufacturing or engineering, because that's not one of the sectors that's picked up yet. I should add that most of the growth that we've seen in the positivity has been in services. Legal, professional, financial services, IT and comms. So we haven't really seen it in there. And the other sector that is quite subdued at the moment is the construction sector. Struggling for staff. Supply chain issues seem to have eased. Clearly the announcement last week about NHS projects being on hold for at least 2 years had a bit of an impact there. It will take time for that capacity for the industry, the sector, to work out what that really means for it. But manufacturing, engineering, construction, we're not seeing many requests for working capital uplifts there.
Mary, do you want to reflect on that? Or?
Yeah, just to say that manufacturing, if we look at over the period since, before the pandemic and looking at how things have recovered, Scotland versus the UK, pretty much in the same place overall, but the sectoral differences are quite stark, and particularly on manufacturing, Scotland does seem to have recovered much more poorly than the UK as a whole, pretty much across the board on all the manufacturing subsectors. So I think there is something interesting going on there potentially in Scottish manufacturing, compared to, sort of pre-pandemic levels. So, we're going to continue to dig about in the data to try and figure out what's going on, but it is interesting that sort of chimes with what Kevin's hearing.
Next question.
Anne Packard, it's related to Mark, if I may. When you pose the questions, do you actually track the age of the respondents? Because you said young is under 40, whereas if, for example, you look at young Scott, it's under 25.
Sure.
And then do people also respond giving any indication of whether they work in the public, the private or third sector?
Well, the answer to that is yes on both counts. Yeah, we know exactly how old people are. I think I was making a slightly flippant point about people in their, well, not entirely, but slightly flippant point about people in their 40s still being young. I think the point I'm trying to make is that it's throughout the survey that is the key kind of variable, I think, to look at, not the only one. But it explains a lot in terms of how you feel about the economy, your levels of pessimism and optimism, and your kind of priorities and your spending habits. It's one of the kind of key explainers, I think, as as to what's going on. In terms of where people's if people are working and where they're working, yeah, we can track that as well, and you can see that in the detailed data. I would say that's less important as I mean, for some questions it's important, but and it's still worth looking at. But it's I would, when you look at the data, I would be looking at the age variable as the key one here throughout.
Can I just add really quickly as well? We've been collecting in our business survey for the last year or so an indicator about whether organisations consider themselves to be in the third sector, because we're very interested in, social enterprises or other organisations who are in our sample, we're going to do another analysis of that in the next quarter, but it does generally seem to show that those sorts of organisations feel more less resilient and more on the brink, more vulnerable, definitely, and less optimistic than the business space as a whole, which is probably what you would expect. But we do like to be able to compare those organisations on the same kind of basis as more traditional businesses. I think that's quite interesting.
And sorry, just one other point. While I'm not playing down the employment thing, there's some really strong data here around people who are employed. I'm not talking about whether in the private or public sector, but in work poverty is a really big issue, and in work kind of pessimism is a really big issue as well. The stuff that's kind of off the scale in terms of pessimism or in terms of spending behaviours applies in some cases more to people in work actually than it does to people who aren't in work. So I think that's a really important point to make. We don't necessarily see a public sector, private sector sort of differential in terms of people who are working, but it's really, really worth looking at some of the data around people who are working, because they are really feeling it.
Mentioned one of the numbers that I always look at first, which is the number of people losing sleep over their finances, and that's partly because it connects to other work that we're doing on the Great Risk Transfer. And that number for 35 to 44-year-olds is up at 40%, or I think 39%, but we track that. And the interesting thing is, because we've tracked it over time, you could actually see when the Scottish Child Payment came in, I think, because at that point they had the Scottish Child Payment and the energy subsidy. And then you could see in the next survey that number going up when the energy subsidy came off, but the Scottish Child Payment was still there. So there is a lot of interpretation that goes on behind the scenes, and we can only give you the high-level stuff today, but we are tracking that over time. Sorry.
Cool. I'm sorry, Matt from Grayling Public Affairs. So I can't not really ask a political question. Just wondering, in terms of obviously a big debate at the moment with the Scottish budget with changes in income tax, but also the balance between that and whether or not you get better public services coming out of the back of it. Was there anything in the qualitative data that kind of shone a spotlight on how people were concerned about that, how much it kind of relates into their thinking as to whether or not we're going in the right direction or not?
I mean, I wouldn't say so directly, if I'm honest. We didn't ask specifically about the budget, and we didn't ask specifically about tax. I mean, there is a lot of data around about the extent to which people support or oppose additional tax.
So we added an
Well,
extra question in at the end this time, partly connected to the work we're doing on the Great Risk Transfer.
Yeah.
We haven't covered it in
No.
this, but do you want to say a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, you'll see it in the report. I mean, it's basically around the extent to which there's kind of a kind of collective feeling around what's going on in the economy, which really does come out. I mean, I'm afraid it doesn't get to exactly what you're asking for, but yeah, do have a look at some of that stuff in the report. It's worth it.
Question around collective responsibility and safety nets and
Yeah.
Oh, I'm being told off the microphone. Sorry, you go.
Thanks, Mark. It was evident from the first slide that young people are concerned about inflation, older people about healthcare. One of the next slides talked about, again, inflation and then public spending being a concern. Without having seen the detail of the report, I think you said it was older people as well. Was that primarily driven again by healthcare, or do you have any detail around what types of public spending there's concern around?
Primarily driven by healthcare. And I think what I'm describing with these age differentials is not entirely, one half of the population thinks this and the other half thinks that. But there are significant age differences here. And it kind of makes sense, right? I mean, the older you get, probably the more you rely on public services in kind of different ways. And levels, and we see this in other survey data, levels of concern and levels of kind of unhappiness about the NHS are pretty off the scale at the minute. And I don't just mean in Scotland, we observe it much more widely as well. So yes, it's very much driven by what people are seeing and experiencing in the NHS specifically. Yeah.
Ken Ross. Mark, thanks for the survey information. The priorities, the one that's showing the greatest increase is economic growth. And is the population looking to economic growth to be a sort of panacea or a solution and want to see that encouraged and facilitated?
I think there is probably more discussion about economic growth than there has been for quite a while. I don't know if the others would sort of agree with that. It's more of an issue because other models are now being, other models of growth, like well-being and other models of growth are being put forward. So I think we do see it. I think we do see it as being, and the public see it as being more of a priority now. I think particularly given we've been through periods, as Kevin was saying, where we've had either none or hardly any, and that is a quite significant part of the discussion. So I think it probably reflects that, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, and the recognition that the fact that we've had very poor growth and very poor growth in living standards really since the financial crisis, to be honest. As a direct consequence of having very poor growth in the economy. In order to redistribute wealth, we need to create it. And you can see a direct correlation between the poor performance of the economy and the contraction in living standards over the last 15 years. So I feel like it is more in the public's mind that's there's a direct link between those two things. And obviously we've heard politicians talk about it, a lot, particularly in the last 18 months. And, even the discussion about the Scottish budget yesterday, opposition politicians were saying the key thing is growth. They weren't giving a lot about what they would do to sort of, of course everybody wants that. Well, many people want that. But the trouble is, in order to achieve growth, you need to be looking at the long-term drivers of productivity. And that's, sometimes long-term investments and skills in the health of our population, which is one of the main things holding Scotland back compared to the rest of the UK, to be honest, because we are much sicker in the workforce. And also to encourage and facilitate business investment, which again, we're much further behind than the UK are on business investment, and the UK aren't very good at it either. So really focusing in not just on productivity as an aggregate, but what actually drives productivity and how we invest in those drivers of productivity. But it isn't easy in a period where there's just not much money about.
If I could just come in on that. Our customers every day sit and think about growth. They're brilliant at being entrepreneurial and looking for opportunities. And they're struggling to sometimes deal with the immediate pressures of, energy rise, cost rises, lack of staff, to be able to spend time thinking about the business rather than working in the business. And one of the things that they hear quite a lot about is investment in AI. But actually, if you're really busy dealing with the here and now, lots of that stuff appears to be quite abstract. You think it's going to be time consuming. You might make a mistake, you might spend a fortune, so actually it's easier not to do anything. But productivity conundrum in Scotland is something that our customers are grappling with every day, and they would love to grow. They just haven't quite managed to unlock that yet.
Yeah, and for some companies, I'm quite worried about the sort of conflation between technology in general and just digitisation and AI, because, there are a lot of companies in Scotland which are in that sort of tail of companies who, could do things which are not the frontier of technology, but are maybe more bit more straightforward than thinking about AI and that sort of thing, which would significantly increase the productivity of their businesses.
Is there in your questioning on that point, is there a desire to see strategic intent translated into operational reality. We're fed up with the fine words. Is the population now starting to sort of react and are looking for actions rather than rhetoric?
Just to interrupt before you, I'm sitting on 3 questions from the audience here.
Okay.
And we've got 10 minutes. Well, no, we've got 7 minutes left. So can we answer that with another question, or should we answer that and then go to 3 questions together?
Probably
Do that
okay.
quickly then, Mark.
So I think, well, probably, yeah. I mean, I think what we're seeing, whether it's in like public services, whether it's in the direct, wrong and right direction question, we are seeing, significant levels of dissatisfaction with how people are experiencing their sorts of everyday lives. Whether that's dealing with public services, whether that's in their salaries and wages and whatever. And I think that's the period that we're in. I wouldn't say it's in any way unique to Scotland at all, but the data would point to that. Whether that's I'm sick of rhetoric and I want to see delivery, I don't know. But I mean, it is definitely a lack of delivery, I would say. Yeah.
Vicky Crichton. I'm interested in the responses to the cost of living crisis, and some of those appear to have potential short-term impacts, people cutting back on non-essential spending, but others have really significant long-term impacts, like reducing savings and so on. I'm just interested in what you see as the long tail, even if we are moving in a positive direction.
Samuel Mora from University of Edinburgh. Now, there's this notion that Scottish people are generally less enthusiastic even during good times. And I wondered if we corrected for that, in the perceptions that the people have responded with, would we still be as concerned?
And final question to Andy McKeever over here.
Thank you, Susan. Andy McKeever, Message Matters, Zero Matters, Holyrood Sources. I answer to everything, really. Mary, you did good analysis at the budget of behavioural change as a result of tax changes. I just wondered, it's maybe partly a question for Kevin as well, actually. How possible, if at all, is it to analyse the behavioural change of people who are not here yet, people who might decide not to come, either individuals or investors, as a result of the tax regime?
Wow, a broad range of 3 questions there. The panel, I'll give a second to think together. So, long-term consequences in the data, are Scots more dreary? And then Andy's big picture. Over to you.
Shall I go first on the first
Yep.
2? I'll leave you to the last one.
That's fine.
Some of the behavioural stuff I think is really interesting, and it's sticky. I mean, we're not seeing much. We're not seeing much change. I mean, I don't think we could. When we measured. I mean, if we have a trite answer, we sort of measure the here and now rather than the future. I mean, I'm surprised by how sticky some of this is. I think it's, as you were saying, Vicky, I don't know, it's long-term impact on the economy and on people's way of life and so on is something that I think. I'm afraid it's not that's not kind of mine. That's not sort of down to me, but it is something that I think we should be really quite concerned about. Absolutely, yeah.
Are Scottish people more dreary?
Well, I'm from England, as you can tell. I felt fairly dreary this morning in the last few days reading this. I don't think so. Is the sort of honest answer. Not really. So if I look at data, other people's data in other parts of the world, and I mean, you look down south, you're seeing pretty similar stuff. I mean, it's very trite again, but people are pretty fed up, right? If you ask that question, I don't know if it's the exact question, but is the UK going in the wrong or right direction? People in England will tell you pretty much what we're seeing here, right? Obviously, there's elections coming up. There is, and there is a kind of a mood, I think, for change, for political change, and for other change. And we're seeing that here, and we're seeing that down south as well. So I don't think so. I don't think we're necessarily more gloomy than elsewhere. But I agree, it is pretty gloomy still.
Just on the first one, I mean, I suppose it's about my concern about households and what's happened is the resilience of households, particularly at the lower end of the income distribution. If they are spending more of their income now than they were before on essentials, if they are running down any savings they do have, if they have any at all, if they are building up debt, then, you know, if another economic shock comes, which inevitably it will, does that mean, you know, they're less resilient? And obviously some of the concerns about businesses and their, you know, their debt stock and their cash flow and everything would be the same. You know, there could be another economic shock maybe quite soon. And, you know, what that might mean is quite concerning. On behavioural change due to tax differentials, it is possible to do studies to understand in the future what the, you know, the response of taxpayers is to differentials in tax changes, even thinking about how many people we would have expected to come to Scotland in the absence of it, and how many we've seen. But it's not easy because you need to build a decent counterfactual. You know, basically what would have happened if this hadn't happened, and that's not always simple in these sorts of economic studies, but it is possible. So it's whether you can build a reasonable and credible counterfactual. And the Scottish Government and HMRC are working together closely on thinking about, you know, how to look back at the changes that have already been made. But the trouble is you don't know until after you've done it and you look back at the data and you have to see whether you can build that counterfactual, say, well, what do we think would have happened in the absence of these policy changes? So it's not easy, but I would say that the migratory impacts that are likely of big differentials in tax, particularly for those on the higher incomes, isn't about people leaving Scotland. It's about fewer people coming to Scotland than would otherwise have come to Scotland, even if it's 1 or 2 in 100. So that's much more likely, of course, than people sort of fleeing Scotland with bags of money, which some people seem to think it's about.
Just in terms of the long tail, I suppose from COVID, cost of living, there are a number of people who have disappeared from the workforce and are economically inactive. And our customers are missing those people. And there is obviously an opportunity to grab some of those people and retrain them and bring them back in. Because actually for some of them their pension might not last as long as they expected it to. So that there's definitely a discussion to be had there. In terms of inward investment and the impact, Andy, of tax, I was about to say, well, you don't know what you don't know. We don't know what would have happened. However, I would come back to if the impact of government policy in Scotland is an increasing and significant issue for our customers in the PMI survey, then that must be the same for inward investment. They will come and they will talk to advisors like Patrick, and they will understand you know, the lie of the land, and that then must also be having an impact on their business decisions as well.
That is 9:45, and I promised to finish on time so that you could all get to your meetings at 10 o'clock. I can see a couple of people with their coats on ready to go, so I won't spend ages summing up. Usually I give the panel one sentence to leave everyone's thoughts with, but I won't do that today because I don't want to finish over time. We still do have the remainder of the bacon rolls and egg rolls for those vegetarians out there. Please do stay if you're able, and the speakers will be around for a few minutes if they've got any burning questions that you didn't get to ask. But thank you very much from the David Hume Institute for another lively, engaging session. The questions around the segmentation of the data, I think we can do more to share on some of the long-term trends behind the scenes. There are definite, really stark SIMD trends and age trends that Mark touched on, but the difference between the first and second quartiles in the SIMD index and the top are really stark. So worth bearing in mind if you are reading the full report. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to Royal Bank, Murray and Mark, and we hope to see you all again next quarter.